Big Shaq cruised through the quiet suburban streets of Oak Ridge in his sleek black SUV, enjoying the peaceful night air. The hum of the engine was steady, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road. Out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights erupted behind him, piercing through the calm like a siren's scream. Shaq frowned, gripping the steering wheel. What now? He checked the speedometer. Perfectly legal. No traffic signs ignored. No reason for a stop. Yet, here he was, pulling over to the curb, instincts tingling with unease. A police cruiser rolled up behind him. The driver's side door swung open aggressively, and out stepped a cop, mid-40s, built like a linebacker but carrying an air of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. His movements were sharp, almost rehearsed, like a man who had done this 1,000 times and never been questioned. A hard-knuckled fist rapped against the window. "Roll it down, now," the officer barked. Shaq took a breath and hit the button. The glass slid down smoothly, revealing his calm, unshaken face. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" His voice was steady, deep, composed. The cop's gaze flickered over him, eyes sharp, analyzing. Then came the demand, fast and clipped. "License and registration, now." There was no greeting, no explanation, just authority, raw and unfiltered. Shaq's gut tightened. Something about this wasn't right. Big Shaq handed over his license and registration without a word, his massive frame barely shifting in his seat. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just a routine stop. The officer snatched the documents from his hand, flipping through them with exaggerated scrutiny, his lips curling in a smirk. "Big Shaq, huh?" he muttered, the name rolling off his tongue with a hint of disdain. His eyes flicked from the ID to Shaq's face, as if sizing him up. "What brings a guy like you to Oak Ridge at this hour?" Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his temper in check. "Just heading to a meeting," he replied, his tone measured. The officer let out a short, humorless chuckle. "A meeting? Yeah, I bet. Or maybe you're looking for trouble." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then, out of nowhere, "Step out of the vehicle." Shaq's fingers twitched on the steering wheel. His heartbeat stayed steady, but the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His voice was calm, but there was a warning in it. The cop took a step closer, one hand resting near his baton. "I gave you an order. Out of the car. Now." Shaq knew this game. He had seen it before. He had lived it before. The flickering hostility, the hunger for control, the need to remind a man like him where the so-called power lay. A few pedestrians, sensing the unusual tension, had begun to slow down, watching from the sidewalk. A couple across the street whispered, eyes darting to the imposing figure of Shaq and the officer standing rigid beside his SUV. One man reached for his phone, lifting it just enough to start recording. Shaq sighed and unbuckled his seatbelt, pushing the door open. As he stepped out, his towering frame loomed over the officer, but his stance remained relaxed, non-threatening. He wasn't here for a fight. The cop, however, was already bracing for one. "Hands on the hood," he barked, stepping back slightly, fingers twitching toward his baton. Shaq hesitated for a split second, just long enough for the crowd to murmur. Then, keeping his breathing even, he placed his hands on the cool metal of his SUV's hood. That's when the cop shoved him. Not hard enough to knock him over, just enough to send a message. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. A young woman muttered, "That's Big Shaq! What the hell's going on?" Her friend pulled out her phone. Shaq clenched his jaw, fighting the wave of frustration rising in his chest. He had trained for years, discipline, patience, control. He could take a hit. But the principle of it all? That's what burned. "Watch yourself, officer," he warned, his voice low, steady. The cop sneered. "Oh, you think you're in charge here?" He pulled out his baton, tapping it against the palm of his hand. "You big guys always think your size can save you." Shaq didn't move, but in the corner of his eye he saw the reflection of flashing lights. Another patrol car. Backup was arriving, but for who? The second officer stepped out, his brows furrowed as he assessed the scene. "Paul," he called to the first cop, his tone edged with uncertainty. "What's going on here?" Paul didn't turn. His grip on the baton tightened. "Just handling business." Shaq exhaled slowly. The moment was tilting, threatening to spill over into something dangerous, and the entire world was watching. Phones lifted, cameras rolling. You could feel the tension. Shaq could hear the shuffling of feet behind him. The crowd had nearly doubled, people whispering, murmuring. Someone let out a small, nervous laugh, and another person shushed them. The atmosphere was suffocating. the weight of uncertainty pressing down, like a storm ready to break. And then Paul did what Shaq had been waiting for. He swung. The baton cut through the air, aiming for Shaq's ribs, but before it could connect, Shaq moved. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just precisely. A quick pivot, a shift of weight, and suddenly Paul's momentum carried him too far forward. His foot slipped slightly, throwing him off balance for just a fraction of a second. But enough. Shaq didn't strike back. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply let Paul stumble, his own aggression working against him. The crowd reacted instantly. A murmur turned into a ripple of gasps. Someone let out a sharp, "Yo, what the hell?" And another voice said, "Did you see that? He didn't even touch him." Paul's face burned red with fury. He straightened, breathing hard, his nostrils flaring. His fingers tightened around the baton. He was losing control, and he knew it. Shaq, on the other hand, was the picture of composure. "Are you sure you want to do this, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. Paul's jaw clenched. He looked around, suddenly aware of the dozens of phones pointed at him. He had lost control of the situation, and worse, he was losing control of himself. That's when the sirens sounded. Another squad car pulled up, tires screeching slightly against the pavement. Two more officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable as they assessed the scene. The senior of the two, a grizzled officer with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense stance, locked eyes with Paul. "What the hell is going on here?" Paul hesitated, his grip on the baton still white-knuckled. This man was resisting. The silence that followed was deafening. Shaq slowly turned his head, meeting the new officer's gaze. "I wasn't resisting," he said plainly. "I was defending myself from an unprovoked attack." The officer's gaze flickered to the crowd, the dozens of phones capturing every second. He exhaled, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. "Paul," he said slowly, "drop the baton." Paul didn't move. "Now!" The word was like a gunshot. Paul's fingers twitched, then, reluctantly, he let the baton slip from his grip. It clattered against the asphalt, the sound echoing through the thick night air. Shaq didn't move. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply watched as Paul's expression twisted. Anger, shame, something else. "You're done," the senior officer muttered to Paul. "Get in the car." For a moment, it looked like Paul might refuse. But then, with a stiff exhale, he turned and walked toward the squad car. The tension in the air cracked, not fully dissolving, but shifting. The onlookers watched in stunned silence. Some whispered. Others continued filming. The senior officer turned to Shaq. "Sir, are you all right?" Shaq nodded once. "Yeah." The officer hesitated. "Do you want to press charges?" Shaq looked at the car where Paul now sat, his face turned away, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I'll think about it," Shaq said quietly. He wasn't looking for revenge, but he was looking for justice. And this was far from over. Big Shaq stood motionless, his towering frame still, but the fire in his eyes unwavering. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their glow casting long shadows across the tense scene. Officer Paul sat rigidly in the back of the squad car, his jaw clenched so tightly it could have been carved from stone. His face, previously burning with arrogance, was now pale, his hands fists in his lap. The senior officer, Captain Harris, shifted his weight, his gaze flicking from Shaq to the growing crowd. The weight of a dozen recording phones bore down on the moment. This wasn't just an internal issue anymore. This was public. "I need statements," Harris finally said, his voice firm but measured, "and I need them now." One of the younger officers hesitated. "Captain, with all due respect, we already have statements." He gestured toward the sea of phones, all capturing the truth in real time. Harris exhaled sharply. He knew what that meant. There would be no sweeping this under the rug, no quiet discipline behind closed doors. This was bigger than just another officer's misconduct. This was a reckoning. Shaq remained silent, but his posture spoke volumes. He wasn't looking for sympathy, wasn't searching for vindication. He simply stood as the living proof of what had just unfolded. Then, from the crowd, a voice rang out. "Arrest him!" The ripple was instant. Murmurs turned to demands, voices rising with conviction. "That's right. If that was any of us, we'd already be in cuffs," someone shouted. Paul, still locked in the back seat, whipped his head toward the commotion. His chest rose and fell in quick succession, the reality of his situation closing in around him like walls with no doors. Harris turned toward the squad car, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who liked to be backed into a corner, but the evidence was undeniable. "Paul," he said finally, his voice low but firm, "you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Paul's face darkened. You can't be serious. Harris didn't blink. Serious enough that Internal Affairs will be reviewing every second of what just happened here. Paul looked like he might argue, his mouth twitching as if searching for words. But he found none. Shaq, still watching, finally spoke. This isn't about me, he said, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. It's about the fact that this could have been anyone. And if nobody was watching, if there weren't cameras, what would have happened then? The weight of his words pressed on every person standing there. Harris sighed, rubbing his temple before turning to Shaq. Sir, if you'd like to file an official complaint, I'll personally ensure it's reviewed. Shaq nodded once. I intend to. The scene had shifted. What started as an abuse of power was now the beginning of something bigger. Paul had lost his grip on control. But the real battle, it was only just beginning. The night air felt thick, charged with an energy that crackled between the crowd and the officers. Big Shaq stood firm, his expression unreadable, his presence a silent challenge to the very system that had just tried to subdue him. Officer Paul, now sitting stiffly in the back of the squad car, was breathing heavily. His mind raced, replaying the last 15 minutes in his head like a bad dream. He had lost control, not just of the situation, but of himself. And now the weight of his actions was pressing down like a vice. Captain Harris turned to the younger officers. Secure the scene. We're done here. But the crowd wasn't. You think that's enough? A woman's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. If that was any of us, we'd already be in handcuffs. A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Some still had their phones up, recording, ensuring that no part of this moment would be lost. Paul gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to lash out, to do something, to take back the control that had slipped so easily from his grasp. But there was no taking it back. Shaq turned his head slightly, eyes locking onto Paul's through the glass of the squad car. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat, he just watched. It was almost worse than if he had spoken. Paul broke the stare first. Harris exhaled, rubbing his temple. He wasn't new to messes like this, but he knew this one was different. This wasn't a complaint that could be brushed under the rug. This wasn't going to go away. Paul, Harris finally said, his voice low but firm, you need to understand something. Paul didn't respond. You did this to yourself, Harris continued, nobody else. Paul let out a bitter laugh, short and humorless. Yeah? And what happens now? Harris folded his arms. Now? Now we do our jobs the way we should have from the start. He turned to Shaq. Sir, if you'd like to come down to the station, we can file your complaint officially. Shaq considered it for a moment. He had every right to walk away, to let the videos speak for themselves. But that wasn't the kind of man he was. I'll be there, he said. Harris nodded and signaled for his officers to move. As the tension began to break, the crowd started to disperse, but their eyes lingered. They weren't forgetting. Not tonight. Not ever. Paul shifted in his seat, staring out the window. He had spent years carrying his badge like a shield, believing it made him untouchable. Now it felt like a ticking time bomb. The videos hit the internet before Big Shaq even reached the station. Clips of the confrontation spread like wildfire, flooding social media. News headlines exploded. Police officer caught abusing power on camera. Big Shaq faces unjust traffic stop. But what happens next? The world was watching. At the station, Shaq sat across from Captain Harris in a small, dimly lit office. The air was thick with unspoken tension. A legal advisor sat nearby, taking notes as Shaq officially filed his complaint. You know this isn't just going to disappear, right? Harris said, his tone edged with exhaustion. Shaq leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest. That's the point. Meanwhile, in another room, Paul sat alone, staring at the blank wall in front of him. His badge and gun had already been taken, standard procedure for an officer under investigation. His fingers drummed against the table, his mind racing. He had spent years enforcing the law, bending it when he thought he could. But now he was the one under scrutiny. A door creaked open. A fellow officer, one Paul had worked with for years, stepped inside. But the look on his face wasn't friendly. It was disappointment. They're putting you on suspension, he said flatly. Pending an investigation. Paul scoffed. Suspension? Over that? His colleague's jaw tightened. Over everything, he corrected. This isn't just about one night, Paul. People are digging into your past reports, old complaints. You think this is the first time someone's questioned your actions? Paul fell silent. Across town, social media was on fire. Comments poured in under the viral clips. If this can happen to Big Shaq, what happens to regular people with no cameras? This officer needs to be held accountable, period. I've seen too many stories like this. Enough is enough. But the real twist? A major news network picked up the footage. It wasn't just an online controversy anymore. It was national. And if you thought this was intense, wait until you see what happens next. What do you think? Should Paul just be suspended, or should he be fired? Comment below. And if you want to see what happens next, hit that subscribe button. This story is far from over. The morning after the confrontation, the entire Oak Ridge Police Department was in turmoil. The video of Officer Paul's abuse of power had exploded beyond social media. It was on the morning news, dissected by legal analysts, and even trending on national television. The pressure was mounting, and the department knew they couldn't ignore it. In his office, Captain Harris rubbed his temples as he watched a news anchor dissect the footage. "It's not just about Big Shaq," the reporter said. "This raises a bigger question. How many times has this happened when the cameras weren't rolling?" Harris exhaled sharply. He had spent decades in law enforcement, trying to do things the right way. But now he was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. There were cracks in the system, and Paul had just exposed one of the biggest. Down the hall, Paul sat in an interrogation room, hands folded, eyes unfocused. His suspension was official, but it was clear to everyone that this wasn't going to end with a slap on the wrist. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation, and officers who had once called him a friend now avoided his gaze. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped in. David McMillan, a high-ranking official from the Civilian Oversight Committee. He set a file down on the table and gave Paul a long, calculating look. "You know why I'm here," McMillan said. Paul didn't answer. McMillan tapped the file. "Your record's not clean, Paul. We've found multiple complaints against you. Excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, all brushed under the rug because there wasn't enough evidence." Paul's jaw tightened. "But this time," McMillan continued, "there's evidence, video footage, witnesses. And let's not forget who you did this to." Paul scoffed. "So what? Because he's Big Shaq, suddenly it matters?" McMillan leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Number. It matters because you finally got caught." Paul's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to argue, to fight back, to defend himself. But what could he say? The world had seen what he did. And for the first time, he couldn't control the narrative. Meanwhile, across town, Big Shaq sat in a meeting with his legal team. His complaint had been filed, but he wasn't just looking for a personal victory. He wanted change. "We have leverage," one of his attorneys said. "Not just to hold Paul accountable, but to push for real reform in this department." Shaq nodded. He didn't just want an apology. He wanted action. And as the walls started closing in on Officer Paul, one thing was certain. This fight was far from over. The walls of the interrogation room felt like they were closing in on Officer Paul. He sat stiffly, staring at the file in front of him, his mind racing. His whole career, his life, was unraveling before his eyes. The accusations, the footage, the outrage. There was no escaping this. David McMillan, the civilian oversight official, watched him carefully. "You have two choices, Paul," he said, his tone controlled but firm. "You fight this, lose your badge, and possibly face charges. Or you cooperate." Paul scoffed. "Cooperate? With what?" McMillan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Help us clean up this mess. You weren't the only officer cutting corners, were you?" Paul's pulse quickened. He knew exactly what McMillan was getting at. Internal corruption, patterns of misconduct that had been ignored for years. He had been a part of it, sure, but he wasn't the only one. He swallowed hard. "You're asking me to rat out my own department?" "I'm asking you to do the right thing," McMillan corrected. "For once." Paul exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. He wasn't sure what was worse, losing everything or being the guy who turned on his own. Meanwhile, across town, Big Shaq was stepping into the police station, the energy in the building shifting the moment he arrived. Officers exchanged glances, whispers filled the air. This wasn't just another citizen walking in. This was a man the whole country was watching. Captain Harris met him at the entrance. His face was unreadable. "Mr. Shaq," he greeted, motioning him toward a conference room. Inside, Shaq sat across from Harris, McMillan, and a few other high-ranking officials. His legal team was beside him, their expressions firm. "We're taking action," Harris started. "Paul is under investigation. But let's be real. This isn't just about him." Shaq nodded. "That's right. This is about the culture you've allowed to fester here." Silence hung in the air. Macmillan cleared his throat. We want to propose something. He slid a document across the table. A full review of the Oak Ridge Police Department. A chance to change the way things operate. Training, accountability, real reform. Shaq studied the paper. And what guarantees do I have that this isn't just PR cleanup? Harris exhaled. You'll be involved. You'll have a voice. Shaq's jaw tightened. He hadn't asked for this fight, but now that he was in it, he wasn't backing down. Then let's get to work, he said. Back in the interrogation room, Paul ran a hand over his face. The weight of his choices crushed down on him. He had spent years demanding respect, but now he realized